When Shaquille O'Neal starts washing his own car in his upscale neighborhood, one bitter woman sees it as a crime. With a single 911 call, sirens blare, squad cars swarm, and a peaceful morning spirals into national chaos. But what happens next? No one sees coming. A shocking twist of karma, a public reckoning, and a response from Shaq that leaves the world speechless. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun was bright, casting a warm glow over the quiet, neatly arranged houses of Oak Ridge Heights. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming jasmine from the perfectly manicured lawns. Birds chirped in harmony, adding to the peaceful suburban setting. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel normal, predictable, even safe. Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, stood in the driveway of his sprawling yet understated home, humming a tune as he rinsed off his deep black customized SUV. The vehicle was a beast, polished rims, tinted windows, and a presence as commanding as the man himself. Yet for Shaq, it wasn't about the flash. He loved taking care of his things, loved the simplicity of normal chores that most millionaires would leave to someone else. His massive hands gripped the sponge, soap suds dripping onto the pavement as he scrubbed with a rhythm only he could find enjoyable. The sun reflected off the clean metal as water droplets rolled down, disappearing into the cracks of the driveway. For him, this was therapeutic, his way of staying grounded despite living in a world most could only dream of. A few doors down, an older couple walked their golden retriever, nodding at Shaq with friendly smiles. A group of kids rode their bikes past his house, giggling as they pointed at the legendary basketball star. He smiled back, tossing them a playful wave before returning to his car. But not everyone in Oak Ridge Heights was so welcoming. Across the street, behind a primly trimmed hedge, Karen Whitmore stood with her arms crossed, her sharp blue eyes fixed on Shaq with something between suspicion and disdain. A thin woman in her late 50s, Karen was the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood, a watchdog of proper behavior. Her expensive cardigan was draped over her shoulders, her blonde bob perfectly styled, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against the railing of her porch. She watched Shaq as if he didn't belong, as if his very presence disrupted the fabric of the community. It didn't matter that he was a millionaire, a celebrated athlete, or even a known philanthropist. To Karen, he was simply out of place. She took a sip of her morning coffee, lips curling in distaste. "Look at him," she muttered to herself. "Why does he have to act like that?" Her husband, Richard, barely looked up from his newspaper. "Like what?" "Like common folk," she scoffed. "Washing his own car. It's just not right." Richard sighed, used to her daily complaints about the most insignificant things. "Maybe he just likes it." Karen rolled her eyes. "People like him don't belong here, Richard. You know it. I know it. It's only a matter of time before he starts bringing in more, like him." She turned her attention back to Shaq, gripping her phone tighter. The way he stood there, so comfortable, so unbothered, made her blood simmer. It was almost defiant in her mind. He wasn't playing by her unspoken rules, and that bothered her more than anything. A car slowed down in front of Shaq's house. A man in a dark suit stepped out. It was Elliot Grayson, a wealthy investment banker who had moved into the neighborhood a year ago. Elliot was another one who had never quite warmed up to Shaq's presence, though he never made it as obvious as Karen did. "Morning, Shaq," Elliot said, forcing a polite nod. "Morning," Shaq replied, wringing out the sponge. Elliot lingered, his eyes scanning the car, then Shaq. "Didn't take you for the type to wash your own ride." Shaq chuckled, unbothered. "Gotta stay humble, man." Elliot smirked, though there was a certain undertone to his expression. Something calculated. "Yeah, I guess." He adjusted his tie, giving Karen a small nod as he walked back to his car. Karen pursed her lips. She didn't trust Shaq, and she didn't like how comfortable he was becoming here. She glanced at her phone. Maybe it was time someone did something about it. Across the street, Shaq continued washing his car. Still completely unaware that his peaceful morning was about to take a turn he never saw coming. Karen Whitmore stood stiffly on her porch, her manicured fingers clenching the phone like it was a weapon. She watched Shaq laugh, effortlessly enjoying his morning, and it irritated her in ways she couldn't explain. He was too big, too loud, too comfortable. It was wrong. It was unnatural. This was her neighborhood, and in her mind, people like him weren't supposed to act as if they belonged. Her jaw tightened as she took a slow sip of her now lukewarm coffee, her eyes darting toward Elliot Grayson's house. He had already left, but she knew he agreed with her. Most of the neighbors did. They just weren't brave enough to say it outright. But Karen? She wasn't afraid to take action. She took a breath, her pulse quickening as she unlocked her phone. The emergency dial pad lit up on the screen. Her fingers hovered over the numbers for just a second before she made her decision. She dialed 911. The phone rang twice before a female dispatcher answered, her voice calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Karen stepped back into the shadows of her porch, lowering her voice just enough to sound urgent, but not frantic. Yes, I need to report a suspicious individual outside my house. He's acting erratic, and I think he might be dangerous. The dispatcher's tone remained steady. Can you describe the individual, ma'am? Karen's lips curled slightly. She knew exactly how to phrase this. He's a very large black man, easily over 7 feet tall. Dressed in baggy clothes, pacing near an expensive vehicle. I don't know if he's trying to break into it or what, but it just doesn't look right. There was a pause on the other end. The dispatcher seemed to hesitate, but protocol demanded she take the report seriously. What exactly is he doing that seems dangerous? Karen glanced back at Shaq, who was now rinsing the car again, casually chatting with a passerby. Mrs. Cartwright, the sweet old woman who always baked cookies for the neighborhood kids. He was smiling, laughing, completely at ease. Karen's grip on her phone tightened. He's being aggressive, she said quickly. Moving erratically, making big gestures. I feel threatened just watching him. And I'm all alone here. The dispatcher exhaled, clearly noting the choice of words. Large black man. Aggressive. Threatened. Alone. Words that carried weight in America. I'll send officers to check it out, the dispatcher finally said. Please stay inside and do not engage with him. Karen allowed herself a small, satisfied smirk as she hung up. Shaq had no idea. He was in his own world, the sun warm on his skin, the cool water splashing against his arms as he rinsed down his SUV. His Bluetooth speaker blasted old-school soul music, and he hummed along, bobbing his head to the beat. Mrs. Cartwright leaned on her cane beside him, chuckling at something he'd just said. You always wash your own car, big fella? She asked, adjusting her glasses. Yes, ma'am, Shaq replied with a grin. I could pay someone, but what's the fun in that? Mrs. Cartwright laughed. A man with millions still doing his own chores? That's something special. Shaq winked. Keeps me humble. They shared a warm moment, the kind that made life in a community like this worth it. Shaq liked being part of the neighborhood, liked feeling normal outside the world of fame. As Mrs. Cartwright shuffled away, another car pulled up, a father and his young son. The boy, around 8 years old, gasped when he recognized Shaq. Dad, that's Big Shaq, the boy whispered excitedly. Shaq turned and flashed his signature grin. That's me, big man. The boy's eyes widened in awe. Whoa! Shaq laughed, reaching into the back seat of his SUV. He pulled out a signed basketball and tossed it lightly toward the boy. Keep practicing, and maybe one day you'll be bigger than me. The boy's hands barely wrapped around the ball as he held it close to his chest. His father gave Shaq a grateful nod. Appreciate you, man, the father said. Shaq nodded back. Always. For him, these were the moments that mattered, the real connections, the chance to inspire. And yet, just across the street, something very different was brewing. The dispatcher, Jessica Malone, tapped her pen against her desk, staring at the flagged call on her screen. Something didn't sit right. She knew exactly who Shaquille O'Neal was. Everyone did. NBA legend, philanthropist, a household name. The idea of him acting aggressively in his own neighborhood seemed ridiculous. Jessica hated calls like this. She had worked in dispatch long enough to recognize racially charged exaggerations when she heard them. but she also knew she couldn't ignore the complaint. The moment it was logged, it became a liability issue. If something happened and she didn't send officers, she'd be held accountable. She sighed, rubbing her temples before keying into her radio. Unit 45, respond to a suspicious person report at Oak Ridge Heights, 3427 Westmore Lane. Caller states possible aggressive behavior near a parked vehicle. The response was immediate. Copy that. En route. Jessica's gut twisted. She knew how these things went down sometimes, and it never ended well. Shaq checked his phone, wiping sweat from his brow. He had a few texts from friends, a couple of business emails, but nothing urgent. Just another normal day. Until he heard the sirens. His head lifted, brows furrowing as 3 police cars turned onto his street, moving faster than necessary for a suburban neighborhood. The chatter of the community immediately died down. The father and son who had just been laughing with him? They froze, the father instinctively placing a protective hand on his child's shoulder. Mrs. Cartwright stopped in her tracks, her aged face twisting in concern. And then, Shaq saw Karen, standing on her porch, arms crossed, watching with cold satisfaction. His stomach dropped. The squad cars came to an abrupt stop, doors flying open. Officers stepped out cautiously, hands hovering near their holsters. Shaq's heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. This wasn't happening. Not here. The lead officer, Sergeant Daniels, was a stocky man in his late 40s with a stern face. He locked eyes with Shaq, assessing him, his massive frame, his presence. "Sir?" Daniels called out, stepping forward. "Can I have you step away from the vehicle?" Shaq let out a slow breath, keeping his voice even. "This is my car." Daniels' face remained neutral, but his stance was tense. "We got a call about suspicious activity. We just need to check things out." Shaq could feel every pair of eyes on him. The father with his son, Mrs. Cartwright, the neighbors peeking from behind their curtains, and Karen, smirking like she had won something. He had done nothing. But in this moment, that didn't seem to matter. And just like that, a peaceful morning had turned into something else entirely. The piercing wail of sirens shattered the morning calm, sending a ripple of unease through Oak Ridge Heights. The quiet suburb, with its pristine lawns and elegant driveways, was not accustomed to such commotion. Residents peeked out from behind curtains, drawn by the urgency in the sound, their faces etched with curiosity and apprehension. Shaquille O'Neal stood frozen, his massive frame towering over the sleek black SUV that had, moments ago, simply been a car he was washing. Now, under the flashing red and blue lights, it had become something else, a symbol of suspicion, a trigger for unwarranted authority. 3 squad cars skidded to a stop, doors flying open in practiced synchronization. Officers moved with rigid precision, their hands hovering near their holsters, their eyes scanning the scene. Their postures spoke of caution, of readiness, as though they had arrived at a crime in progress. Shaq's brow furrowed, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. He had lived enough life to know that one wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, could change everything in an instant. The lead officer, Sergeant Daniels, stepped forward. He was stocky, square-jawed, and carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much. His eyes, however, held something else, an evaluation, a silent calculation of the man standing before him. Shaq inhaled deeply, then slowly raised his hands, palms facing forward in the universal sign of compliance. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity," Daniels said, voice steady but firm. "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." Shaq remained still for a beat, his expression unreadable. Suspicious activity? Washing his own car? The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but he knew better. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, lowering his hands just enough to gesture toward his home. "This is my house," he said evenly, "and that's my car." Behind the police line, a figure emerged, moving with the smug arrogance of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Elliot Grayson. A wealthy investment banker with a taste for power, Elliot was a man who lived for social dominance. From the moment Shaq had moved in, Elliot had seen him as a threat, not because of anything Shaq had done, but because his presence disrupted the quiet hierarchy of the neighborhood. He adjusted his tie as he stepped closer, just enough to be within earshot of the officers. "I saw everything," Elliot said smoothly. He was acting aggressive. Shaq's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He knew how words could be twisted, how silence was sometimes the only defense. Karen Whitmore, emboldened by Elliot's presence, stepped forward as well. Her expression was one of carefully curated concern, her voice laced with exaggerated worry. "I was terrified," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "He was moving erratically. I don't know what he was planning, but I didn't feel safe." The tension thickened. The officers exchanged glances, their initial caution hardening into something more rigid, more dangerous. Shaq finally spoke, his voice measured but firm. "You really think I'd steal my own car?" Sergeant Daniels hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. He wasn't blind to who Shaq was, but protocol dictated that he couldn't simply walk away now that the situation had escalated to this point. One of the younger officers, Officer Reed, shifted uncomfortably. He was in his late 20s, relatively new to the force, and unlike some of his colleagues, he wasn't immune to common sense. He knew Shaquille O'Neal, knew his reputation, knew his legacy. Yet here he was, standing in front of a legend, treating him like a suspect. The absurdity of it gnawed at him. "Sir," Sergeant Daniels said again, his voice holding just a sliver of doubt now, "we just need to verify some information. Can you provide proof of ownership for the vehicle?" Shaq's lips pressed together. His keys were already in the ignition. His registration was inside. He could reach for it, but should he? He had seen how these things went. A simple motion, misinterpreted. A reach for papers mistaken for something else. The father and son who had just been laughing with him watched in silence now. The father's face pale, his hand gripping his child's shoulder a little tighter. Mrs. Cartwright had not moved from her spot. Her old eyes, full of wisdom and experience, held something heavy. A silent plea, as if she had seen this all before. The moment stretched, thin as glass, ready to shatter with the slightest wrong movement. Finally, Shaq did the only thing that felt safe. He spread his arms wide, looking directly at Daniels. "I'm not making any sudden moves. If you want to check my registration, you can do it yourself." The words hung in the air. A quiet challenge. A declaration of restraint, not submission. Sergeant Daniels exhaled, his tension shifting into something else. Not quite defeat, but understanding. He gave a small nod, signaling to Officer Reed, who cautiously moved toward the SUV. He opened the driver's side door, reached inside, and pulled out the registration. A beat later, he confirmed into his radio. "Vehicle is registered to Shaquille O'Neal. Owner verified." For a moment, there was silence. Karen's face twisted in frustration. Elliot's smirk faltered just slightly. Shaq let out a slow breath, but he wasn't relieved. He had done nothing wrong, yet it had taken 3 police cars, multiple officers, and a public spectacle to confirm what should have been obvious from the start. Sergeant Daniels looked at Shaq, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Then, he turned to his officers. "Stand down." One by one, hands moved away from holsters. Postures relaxed, if only slightly. The sirens were turned off, but the damage had already been done. The entire neighborhood had witnessed it. The unspoken rules of the world had played out, as they always did. Shaq met Karen's gaze across the lawn. She wasn't sorry. She never would be. But he could see something else in her eyes now. A flicker of doubt. She had called the cops expecting a victory. Instead, she had exposed herself. Shaq turned away, wiping his wet hands on a towel as though shaking off the entire ordeal. Without a word, he walked back to his car, picked up the sponge, and resumed washing. Because at the end of the day, no matter what had just happened, it was still his car, his house, his life, and he refused to let anyone take that away. The tension in Oak Ridge Heights had thickened like an approaching storm, pressing against every set of watching eyes. What had begun as an ordinary morning had transformed into something far more exposed, raw, and revealing. The police officers still stood in formation, though their grips on the situation had begun to slip. Sergeant Daniels had given the order to stand down, but not everyone seemed eager to follow. Some of the younger officers hesitated, their hands twitching near their holsters, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Shaquille O'Neal remained in place, his broad shoulders squared, his hands held slightly away from his body in the universal signal of "I am not a threat." Yet the world around him wasn't built to accept that so easily. One by one, doors creaked open across the street. Neighbors, some hesitant, others outraged, stepped onto their porches, drawn into a moment that demanded attention. The first to step forward was Mr. Langston, an elderly black man who had lived in the neighborhood longer than most of its current residents. He had seen generations move in and out, had watched time shape the world around him, but some things, it seemed, never changed. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, his weathered face tight with frustration. His voice, though laced with age, carried across the street like a quiet thunder. "I've seen this before," he said, shaking his head. "And it never ends well." A hush fell over the gathering. Mr. Langston's gaze flicked between Shaq, the officers, and Karen Whitmore, who still stood stiffly on her porch, arms crossed over her chest like a shield. Karen scoffed, shifting uncomfortably but refusing to meet his eyes. She hadn't anticipated this. She had expected whispers behind closed doors, not open defiance from the community. Shaq exhaled, his patience wearing thin. He turned his head slightly toward Mr. Langston, his voice low but steady. "You don't have to do this," Shaq said, his words carrying the weight of understanding. Mr. Langston lifted his chin. "No, son. I do." And just like that, the floodgates cracked open. From the corner house, Mrs. Alvarez, a retired schoolteacher, stepped forward, her sharp brown eyes filled with outrage. "Shaquille O'Neal has lived here for years," she said, loud enough for the officers to hear. "He's been nothing but respectful. He hands out candy to kids on Halloween, donates to the community center. And you're treating him like some criminal." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering crowd. Across the street, Karen's own daughter, Sophia, clutched her mother's hand, her young face scrunched in confusion. She had grown up watching Shaq wave at her from across the road, had seen him laugh with her father at neighborhood barbecues. She tugged at Karen's sleeve, her voice innocent but cutting. "Mom, that's Shaq," Sophia said. "Why are you lying?" Karen's breath hitched. For the first time since this began, a flicker of uncertainty passed through her expression. Her own daughter had called her out. Not an angry neighbor, not someone she could dismiss, but her own flesh and blood. For a second, the mask of self-righteousness slipped. But Karen was too far in. She yanked Sophia's hand away, her lips curling in frustration. "Stay inside," she snapped, pushing the girl back toward the door. Sophia's eyes shimmered with confusion, but she obeyed, glancing back at Shaq with a lingering expression of doubt. Elliot Grayson, who had been watching with his usual smug detachment, stepped forward, determined to shift the focus back where he wanted it. "Look," he said smoothly, turning toward the officers. "This isn't about race. This is about a disturbance in a quiet neighborhood. You can't just ignore a 911 call." The officers exchanged glances. Some seemed unconvinced. Others clearly wanted to wash their hands of the whole thing. But a couple of them, especially the ones who had hesitated earlier, still looked tense, like they weren't ready to let it go. The air thickened once more. One of the officers, a younger cop named Grant, took a step forward, voice measured but sharp. "Sir, we need you to comply," he said, eyes locked on Shaq. "Please get down on the ground." The crowd erupted in anger. Mrs. Alvarez gasped. Mr. Langston muttered a curse under his breath. Even Sergeant Daniels stiffened, clearly aware that things were veering into dangerous territory. But Shaq? He didn't move. His dark eyes held the younger officer's stare, unwavering, unreadable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but unshakable. "If I do this," Shaq said, "what message does that send?" Officer Grant hesitated. He hadn't expected that. Shaq spread his arms slightly, not in surrender, but in a challenge. "You already know who I am. You already confirmed my identity," he continued. "I'm not a threat. I haven't done anything wrong. But if I get down on that ground in front of my own house, in front of all these people, what does that tell every kid watching?" The silence that followed was louder than the sirens had been. No one spoke. Not the officers, not the neighbors, not even Karen. Then, from the police radio clipped to Sergeant Daniel's belt, the voice of dispatcher Jessica Malone crackled through. Be advised. Suspect is confirmed as property owner and resident. No further action necessary. Stand down. For a moment, no one moved. The younger officers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked relieved, others frustrated. Officer Reed let out a slow breath, his hand finally moving away from his holster. Sergeant Daniels, to his credit, didn't argue with the order. He turned toward Shaq, nodded once, then waved his officers back toward the squad cars. The flashing lights dimmed, the tension in the air releasing like the slow deflation of a balloon. Karen's face was pale now. Her big moment had backfired. The crowd, once hesitant, was no longer afraid to show their disapproval. Shaq exhaled, his broad shoulders finally relaxing, but only slightly. He hadn't won anything. All he had done was survive the moment. And somehow, that felt like a battle in itself. The officers were unsure, the neighbors were angry, and Karen Whitmore was still standing on her porch, arms folded tight, her lips pressed into a thin, smug line. Shaq finally broke the silence. Man, he exhaled, shaking his head before letting a slow, amused smile creep across his face. Y'all really think I can fit in a getaway car? The absurdity of it hung in the air for a beat. A few of the officers, the ones who had already started to doubt this whole thing, shifted uncomfortably. Officer Reed, the youngest among them, let out a barely audible exhale through his nose, a suppressed chuckle he hadn't meant to release. Even Sergeant Daniels, still stiff with authority, couldn't hide the way his mouth twitched slightly. But Karen? Karen did not laugh. She saw the shift happening, the slow unraveling of her narrative, and she did not like it. Her hands clenched into fists as she took a step forward. "This isn't funny," she snapped, her voice sharp and brittle. "I called the police because I felt unsafe." Shaq turned his gaze toward her, his smile fading but his eyes still holding that unshaken calm. "Unsafe?" His voice was even. "From me?" Karen's lips parted, but she had no real answer. And then, before anyone could say anything else, a new voice cut through the tension. "Yo, Shaq, what the hell is going on, man?" Heads turned toward the street as a sleek black car rolled up, slowing to a stop just outside the chaos. The door swung open, and DeAndre Carter stepped out, his phone already pointed at the scene, recording everything. DeAndre was more than Shaq's best friend. He was his brother in everything but blood. They had been tight since Shaq's early NBA days, and if there was one thing DeAndre was known for, it was not keeping quiet when things didn't sit right. "What's up, people?" DeAndre said, sweeping the phone over the scene as he walked forward. "Let me get this straight. Big Shaq, the legend himself, is out here washing his own damn car, and y'all got the cops out here like he's robbing his own house." He flipped the camera, pointing it toward himself, his expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. "Oh, this about to blow up," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he turned the camera back on the cops. Shaq sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He knew how DeAndre operated, and if there was one thing that was guaranteed, it was that this footage wasn't staying local. It was about to go everywhere. It started small, a few dozen viewers watching DeAndre's livestream, dropping comments filled with shock and outrage. But the numbers climbed fast. Within 5 minutes, the stream had thousands of people watching. Within 15 minutes, the hashtag #Big Shaq incident was trending. Within 30 minutes, national news outlets had already picked up the footage. And within the hour, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok were flooded with posts, debating, questioning, and dissecting what was happening in real time. Shaq gets police called on him for washing his own car. Y'all, this is America. At Real Talk News. Karen's at it again. First BBQs, now car washes. Let the man live. At Stay Woke Daily. Imagine calling the cops on a 7'1" millionaire who's literally one of the most recognizable people on earth. You can't make this up. At Hoops Culture. People were furious. Celebrities started reposting, activists began speaking out, and even sports analysts who usually stuck to NBA discussions were weighing in on the unfolding situation. Karen, who had started this whole thing with one phone call, was beginning to realize how fast things were slipping out of her control. Karen's confidence had been solid at first. She had expected support, expected the officers to take her side without question. But now, she saw the younger officers uneasy, the neighbors turning against her, the cameras capturing everything. She wasn't just some woman in the neighborhood anymore. She was a viral villain. Her phone buzzed aggressively in her pocket, the vibrations almost making her flinch. When she pulled it out, her screen was flooded with messages, missed calls, notifications. Her own social media was under attack. People had already found her accounts, plastering her pictures with angry comments. Her name was spreading fast, and it wasn't the kind of fame she had ever wanted. Karen swallowed hard, her hands shaking now. She turned toward Elliot, expecting him to have some kind of plan, some way to fix this. But Elliot? Elliot had already taken a step back. He wasn't an idiot. He could see where this was going. He had no intention of going down with Karen. Maybe we should... He started, but Karen cut him off. No, she hissed. I didn't do anything wrong. Elliot didn't argue, but his expression made it clear. He was done playing this game. Amid all the chaos, Officer Reed stood frozen, his jaw tight, his thoughts running in circles. He had signed up for this job to protect and serve. That was supposed to mean something. But now, as he looked at Shaq, who had done nothing but stand there calmly, and then at Karen, whose story was visibly falling apart, he felt something inside him shift. This wasn't right. He took a slow step back, his fingers relaxing at his sides. Sergeant Daniels noticed the movement and gave him a sharp glance. You good, Reed? Daniels asked, low enough so only he could hear. Reed didn't respond right away. He looked at Shaq one more time, then at the crowd of neighbors, then at DeAndre's phone, which was still capturing everything. Finally, he exhaled and gave a small nod. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm good. But he wasn't. He was done being part of the problem. And as he stepped back, away from the tension, away from the expectation that he should continue playing along, he knew he wasn't the only one. Because this moment, it wasn't just about one man washing his car. It was about something much bigger. An hour had passed since the first squad car arrived. What had once been a false report from a bitter neighbor had now unraveled into something much bigger. The flashing police lights had barely been turned off before news vans began rolling in, their satellite dishes extending into the sky like mechanical arms reaching for a signal. Reporters spilled onto the sidewalk, microphones in hand, their cameramen positioning for the best angles. The story had already taken social media by storm, and now, mainstream media was moving in for the kill. Karen Whitmore had wanted attention. Just not like this. The residents of Oak Ridge Heights, many of whom had watched the situation unfold from their windows, now stood on their porches and lawns, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some were eager to talk, giving sound bites to the reporters about how Shaq had always been a respectful, generous neighbor. Others simply stood back, unwilling to be dragged into a mess they hadn't created. But the one person who refused to be ignored was Karen Whitmore. As reporters caught sight of her standing on her porch, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin, anxious line, they swarmed. Mrs. Whitmore, can you comment on the police call? Did you feel personally threatened by Mr. O'Neal? Are you aware that your call is being labeled a false report? Karen's fingers curled into her cardigan, her heartbeat pounding so loudly in her ears that she barely registered the questions. This was not how today was supposed to go. She had imagined the officers thanking her for her vigilance, imagined the neighborhood quietly agreeing with her. Instead, she was being exposed, and it was about to get worse. As the world watched, social media did what it did best, dug into Karen Whitmore's history. Within minutes, old next-door forum posts, complaints, and even past 911 calls began resurfacing. 2019. Karen had called the police on 2 black teenagers for sitting in their car outside their own house, claiming they looked suspicious. 2021. She had reported a Latina housekeeper for lurking near her driveway, even though the woman had been hired by her next-door neighbor. 2022. She had accused a local black delivery driver of trespassing while he was delivering groceries. Karen Whitmore had a pattern. And now, everyone knew it. The first sign of real panic within the police force came when a sleek, black, unmarked vehicle pulled up next to the squad cars. The door swung open, and out stepped Police Chief Malcolm Hayes, a no-nonsense man with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Hayes had seen the live streams, the Twitter debates, the news headlines forming in real time. He knew exactly what this had become: a PR disaster. Sergeant Daniels stiffened when he saw Hayes approaching, immediately stepping forward. "Chief," he started, his voice neutral, but Hayes cut him off with a sharp glance. "What the hell am I looking at here, Daniels?" Hayes asked, his voice low but edged with irritation. Daniels hesitated. "It was a report from a resident, sir. We followed protocol." "Protocol?" Hayes scoffed, his eyes sweeping over the scene. His gaze locked onto Shaq, who was still standing beside his half-washed SUV, arms crossed, watching everything unfold with quiet patience. Shaquille O'Neal, a global icon, a man who had spent decades not only entertaining the world, but giving back to it. And his department had just treated him like a suspect over a garden hose and a bucket of soap. Hayes took a breath, pushing down his frustration before turning back to Daniels. "Tell me you're wrapping this up." Daniels nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. We already verified ownership." "Then why the hell is he still standing there like this is a damn lineup?" Daniels had no answer. Hayes shook his head and muttered something under his breath before stepping forward, his voice louder now, meant for everyone to hear. "This situation is over. Officers, clear the area." The remaining officers, especially the ones who had been hesitating, didn't need to be told twice. The last of them returned to their squad cars, the flashing lights shutting off one by one. The only sound now was the quiet murmuring of reporters and the faint click-click-click of cameras capturing every second of it. And then finally, Shaq spoke. Shaq, who had remained remarkably calm through it all, looked toward the now visibly uncomfortable officers, then at Hayes. His face was unreadable, serious but laced with something that almost felt like amusement. "So," he said, his deep voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "am I free to finish washing my car now?" For a second there was silence. Then, somewhere in the crowd, someone chuckled. Then another. And then, before anyone could stop it, the tension broke. Laughter rippled through the neighbors, even a few of the reporters, even some of the cops. Even Chief Hayes smirked, shaking his head as if to say, "This is a mess." But I respect that. Karen did not laugh. Elliot was already backing away, trying to distance himself. But Shaq? Shaq just picked up his sponge, shook his head, and turned back to his car like this was just another part of his day. And the cameras? They caught every second of it. By the time the news crews started packing up, the moment had already gone viral. Memes flooded social media. Shaq really said, "Can I finish washing my car?" And they had no choice but to pack it up. At the real MVP. Karen called the cops and ended up getting herself canceled instead. Love to see it. At Woke AF, Shaq didn't raise his voice once, didn't argue, didn't resist, just stood there and let them embarrass themselves. At Civic Justice Now, celebrities started commenting. Athletes, actors, and influencers, all of them weighing in, making sure the world knew exactly what had happened in Oak Ridge Heights that morning. Karen Whitmore's name was now everywhere, and not in the way she had hoped. She deactivated her Facebook first, then locked her Twitter. But it was too late. Because this moment, it wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was a national conversation. By the next morning, Oak Ridge Heights was no longer just another quiet, upscale neighborhood. It had become the center of a national conversation. The video of Shaquille O'Neal standing calmly as officers surrounded him had been shared millions of times. News anchors debated the deeper meaning behind the incident, and social media was still on fire, analyzing every angle. But for Karen Whitmore and Elliot Grayson, the world was no longer as comfortable as it had been the day before. They had wanted attention. Now they had it, just not the kind they were prepared for. Karen had barely slept. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages, voicemails, emails. Some were from friends who now wanted nothing to do with her. Others from complete strangers calling her exactly what the internet had labeled her. A racist, a liar, a Karen. By the time she finally checked Twitter, she saw that her name was still trending. But now, alongside words like false police report and neighborhood bigot. It wasn't just this incident being discussed anymore. Her past complaints, the 911 calls, the false accusations against delivery workers, the concerns about black teenagers in the neighborhood had resurfaced. People had dug up old forum posts, screenshots of her heated HOA complaints, and even a petition she had started years ago to keep the neighborhood safe from outsiders, which, as people were now pointing out, was just a coded way to keep people like Shaq out. Her entire reputation was crumbling before her eyes. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, her husband, Daniel Whitmore, walked into the kitchen, his face pale, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. "Karen," he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "What the hell did you do?" Karen looked up sharply. I was just looking out for the neighborhood. You know how things have been changing." Daniel cut her off, slamming his phone down on the counter. The screen was open to an email from his law firm. It was a formal notice of termination. Daniel had been fired, not because of anything he did, but because of her. His firm didn't want the bad publicity, didn't want to be associated with someone who had just become one of the most hated people on the internet. Karen's mouth went dry. "I didn't mean what?" Daniel's voice rose, something rare for him. "Didn't mean to get our family's name dragged through the mud? Didn't mean to destroy my career? Didn't mean to put our daughter in the middle of this?" Karen's stomach twisted painfully at the mention of Sophia. Their 10-year-old daughter had already started getting weird looks at school. The night before, Daniel had checked her iPad and found dozens of messages from classmates. Some were confused, some mocking, and some just straight up cruel. Karen had convinced herself that she had done the right thing, that she had been justified. But now, as she saw the disgust in her husband's eyes and thought about how their daughter would never look at her the same way again, the truth finally started to sink in. She had ruined everything. Across the neighborhood, Elliot Grayson was also facing the consequences of his choices. He had always considered himself untouchable, a respected investment banker, a man with power, wealth, and influence. But the world had changed, and the internet didn't forget. By the time he arrived at his firm's downtown office, his assistant wouldn't even meet his eyes. Inside, his boss, David Kessler, an executive with a sharp suit and even sharper instincts, was waiting for him. The moment Elliot stepped into the office, Kessler threw a newspaper onto the desk. Elliot barely had to glance at the front page to know what it was about. High-profile investor caught in racially charged incident. Social media calls for boycott. Kessler leaned forward, his expression cold. "Elliot," he said, voice clipped, "do you have any idea how bad this looks for us?" Elliot straightened his tie. "Look, You were just what?" Kessler snapped. "Adding fuel to the fire? Getting involved in a situation that had nothing to do with you? Siding with a woman who, by the way, is being investigated for filing a false police report?" Elliot froze. "What?" Kessler's expression hardened. "Yeah. The police department just announced it this morning. They're reviewing all of her past calls to see if there's a pattern of racial profiling." Elliot's stomach dropped. He had known Karen was exaggerating, but he hadn't realized she had a history. Kessler sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Elliot, you're bad for business now. Clients are pulling out. We have to cut ties." Elliot stiffened. "You're firing me?" "Not firing you," Kessler said flatly. "But if you have any sense, you'll resign before this gets worse." Elliot stared at him, feeling a sharp, unfamiliar sense of powerlessness. For the first time in his career, his money, his connections, his status, none of it could save him. While Karen and Elliot were dealing with their personal fallout, the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department was in full damage control mode. Chief Malcolm Hayes had been furious when he first saw the footage. Now, after the public outrage, he had no choice but to act. By noon, the department had issued an official statement promising a full review of all racial profiling complaints within their jurisdiction. And it wasn't just talk. An independent investigation was already underway, looking into past 911 calls from Karen and others like her. Cases that had previously been dismissed were being reopened, re-examined. For some officers, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was long overdue. For Karen, it was just another nail in the coffin. Through it all, Shaq had remained calm. letting the world watch and judge for itself. But as the dust settled, he finally decided it was time to say something. That evening, he sat down for a live interview with a major news network, his expressions serious yet composed. "I love people," Shaq said, his deep voice measured. "I love this country. I love my community. But even for me, a man who's been blessed with fame and fortune, racism is still real. It still happens. And if this can happen to me, imagine what happens to people without a camera, without a platform." The interviewer nodded. "What do you want people to take away from this?" Shaq exhaled, then looked directly into the camera. "I want people to stop pretending like this isn't a problem," he said. "I want us to hold each other accountable. And I want people like Karen Whitmore to understand there are consequences now. The world is watching." The video was shared millions of times, and by the end of the night it was clear. The fallout from Oak Ridge Heights wasn't just about one incident. It was about reckoning. The chaos in Oak Ridge Heights had started to settle, but the impact of what had happened would not fade so easily. Karen Whitmore had become a national pariah, her name synonymous with false accusations and racial profiling. Elliot Grayson had lost everything: his job, his status, and the respect he once commanded. The police department was under intense scrutiny, forced to confront uncomfortable truths. And Shaq? He was still Shaq. Still the same man who had started his day with a bucket of soap and a sponge. The world had expected him to be angry, to demand justice in the harshest way possible. They expected lawsuits, outrage, revenge. Instead, he did something nobody saw coming. The morning after his now viral interview, Shaq sat on his front porch, watching the neighborhood return to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after what had happened. Children rode their bikes down the street, cautious at first, as if testing whether the tension had truly lifted. Neighbors nodded at him, some still hesitant, others more openly supportive now that the world had weighed in. Then, from across the street, a small figure emerged. Sophia Whitmore. She stood there, hands clasped in front of her, eyes filled with uncertainty. The 10-year-old girl who had unknowingly exposed her mother's lie now carried the weight of its consequences. Shaq saw the way she hesitated, glancing back toward the house, as if afraid to cross some invisible line. Her mother was still inside, hiding, avoiding, refusing to face what she had done. Shaq stood up, stretching his arms before walking over to his SUV. He reached inside and pulled out a small envelope. Then, in full view of the neighborhood, he walked across the street. Sophia's eyes widened as Shaq stopped in front of her, towering over her like a friendly giant. He crouched down so they were eye level, then handed her the envelope. "For you," he said simply. Sophia looked at him, then at the envelope, then back at him. Slowly, she peeled it open. Her breath hitched. Inside was a voucher for a brand new car, fully paid for in her name for when she turned 16. She blinked up at him, completely stunned. "Why?" she whispered. "I don't understand." Shaq smiled, his voice kind but firm. "Because the way your mama sees the world, it don't have to be the way you see it." Sophia's throat tightened. She clutched the envelope like it was something sacred. Then, without thinking, she threw her arms around him. For a second, Shaq was surprised, but then slowly, he hugged her back. The moment was caught on camera. And once again, the internet exploded. But Shaq wasn't done. He had spent his entire life building people up, whether through basketball, philanthropy, or simple kindness. And now, in the wake of everything that had happened, he saw an opportunity to do something bigger. He met with Police Chief Malcolm Hayes, sitting across from him in a closed-door meeting that lasted hours. When the meeting was over, an announcement was made. Shaquille O'Neal would be working with the local police department to train officers on handling racial bias, de-escalation, and community relations. The decision was unprecedented. Most people in Shaq's position would have sued the department or demanded high-profile firings. Instead, he chose to educate, to change the system from within. At the press conference, a reporter asked, "Shaq, why not press charges against Karen Whitmore?" Shaq's response was simple. "You can't teach people a lesson if you only punish them. You gotta show them a better way. But not everyone was looking for redemption. Karen Whitmore had spent the past week in self-imposed exile. Her social media was gone. Her husband had stopped speaking to her except in short, clipped sentences. And Sophia? Sophia barely looked at her. The shame was unbearable. The neighbors avoided eye contact. Her once friendly book club had removed her from their group chat, and even the grocery store clerk rushed through her transactions, no longer making polite small talk. She had become a ghost in her own town. And so, she made a decision. One evening as the sun set over Oak Ridge Heights, a moving truck pulled into her driveway. She was leaving. The neighborhood watched from their windows, their porches, their doorsteps. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye, except one person. As Karen finished loading the last box into her car, she turned and saw Shaq standing on the sidewalk, watching her. For a moment, she considered ignoring him. But then, with a deep breath, she walked toward him. Her steps were hesitant. Her face, usually sharp and full of judgment, looked worn down, exhausted. "I was wrong," she said finally. Shaq didn't respond, just watched her, waiting. Karen swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Shaq studied her for a long time. His expression never changed, never softened, never hardened. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't need an apology," he said simply. "I just hope you raise your daughter differently." Karen flinched, because she knew that was the only thing that really mattered now. She gave a small, shaky nod. Then, without another word, she turned and climbed into her car. And just like that, Karen Whitmore was gone. By the time everything settled, Shaq's remarkable response had become the focus of national conversations. His decision to forgive but not forget, to educate instead of punish, had sparked debates, admiration, and even policy discussions. People called him a role model, a leader. But to Shaq, he was just a man who believed in something bigger than hate. And as he stood outside, washing his car once again, neighbors began to walk up to him, not out of fear, but out of respect. One by one, people joined him. A bucket of soap, a sponge, and a lesson that the world would not soon forget. The echoes of what had happened in Oak Ridge Heights did not fade with the passing of weeks. It did not become just another viral moment, forgotten as soon as the internet found something new to focus on. Instead, it became something more. A movement, a conversation, a catalyst for change. Shaq hadn't sought any of it. He hadn't asked for attention or activism. But when the world turned its eyes toward him, expecting anger or retaliation, he had chosen a different path. And that choice rippled out in ways he never imagined. A month after the incident, Shaq launched an initiative aimed at racial justice and community unity. It wasn't just about police reform. It was about bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. The initiative, Bigger Than Hate, focused on 3 key areas. First is community policing education, helping officers recognize implicit bias and de-escalate situations without force. Second is youth engagement programs, creating safe spaces for young people of color to interact with law enforcement in positive ways. Third is rapid response legal aid, ensuring that incidents of racial profiling were documented, challenged, and never ignored. Corporate sponsors, activists, and community leaders rushed to support it. NBA players donated. Former teammates called him, offering to help. Schools reached out, asking for guidance on teaching racial equity to kids. Shaq, who had spent his entire career influencing the world through basketball, now found himself influencing it in an entirely new way. And he was ready for it. The changes didn't stop with Shaq. Officer Reed, the young cop who had hesitated that day, had been deeply affected by what he had witnessed. He had always believed in doing the right thing. But standing there, watching how quickly suspicion had fallen on a man who had done nothing wrong, had changed something inside him. 2 months after the incident, Reed did something that surprised his colleagues. He requested to be transferred to the department's Community Outreach Division. At first, his fellow officers questioned it. Some called it unnecessary. Others said he was overreacting to an incident that had ended peacefully. But Reed knew better. He began speaking at town halls, working with local activists instead of against them. He pushed for changes in department training, advocating for education on racial bias and mandatory de-escalation techniques. And when he got called into his captain's office one day, expecting backlash, he was surprised to hear, "Keep doing what you're doing, Reed. We need more of this." For him, change wasn't about a grand gesture. It was about making sure that what had happened to Shaq never happened again. Life in Oak Ridge Heights eventually settled. Shaq went back to his daily routines, his workouts, his business ventures, his quiet moments of peace in the neighborhood he called home. The moving truck that had taken Karen Whitmore away had long disappeared. Her house was now for sale, her name only spoken in hushed whispers, a reminder of what unchecked bias could cost a person. Elliot Grayson had disappeared from the social scene, his former associates keeping their distance, his name tainted by his choices. And yet, even with everything seemingly back to normal, Shaq knew the fight wasn't over. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. One warm afternoon, Shaq was back in his driveway, doing the one thing that had started it all, washing his car. There were no sirens this time, no flashing lights, just the rhythmic sound of water splashing against metal, the soft hum of music playing from his speaker. As he worked, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned and saw a young black boy, no older than 10, standing at the edge of the sidewalk, watching him with wide eyes. Shaq smiled. "What's up, little man?" The boy hesitated for a second before stepping closer, his voice quiet but sure. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Shaq chuckled, setting the sponge down. He crouched to the boy's level, his massive hands resting on his knees. "You want to be big like me?" he asked. The boy nodded enthusiastically. Shaq grinned. "Then you gotta be big, not just in size, but in heart." The boy tilted his head, thinking about that. Then slowly, he smiled. Shaq reached into the back of his car, pulling out a basketball and handed it to the boy. "Here," he said. "Practice every day. Be great. But most of all, be kind." The boy clutched the ball like it was the most valuable thing in the world. As he ran off, dribbling clumsily down the sidewalk, Shaq watched him go, shaking his head with a smile. The world had changed a little. And maybe, just maybe, the next generation would make sure it kept changing for the better. Some stories make headlines, others spark change. What happened to Shaq wasn't just his story. It's a reality many face, but few witness. The question is, what will you do when it happens again? Stay aware. Speak up. Be bigger than hate. Because real change starts with you.